All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jorge Acosta Palmer, and I'm the director of the statewide training initiative with Florida Legal Services. We're excited to have you join us here today for Avoiding Bad Law, Advocating on Behalf of Consumers and Tenants before the Florida Legislature. This training is being recorded. You're going to receive a copy of the recording in an email from Zoom within 24 hours. If you don't see that email, I'm going to drop my email in the chat just in case. Feel free to reach out to me if there's anything that you need. This training was approved by the Florida Bar for one general and one state and federal government and admin practice CLE credit. I will announce the CLE code at the end of the session. I will also drop it into the chat and it will be announced in that email that's going to go out from Zoom as well. Closed captions are enabled for anybody who needs them. If you're having any issues with accessibility or the captions, you can reach out to me directly. This training is being co-hosted by the Public Interest Law section of the Florida Bar. If you're not familiar with PILS, I encourage you to take a look at their website. We have a lot of great committees and work groups. One of them is the Consumer and Tenant Protections Work Group. And if you're not very familiar with PILS, one way that I see it is I get to meet with Lynn Drysdale once a month at least. So that alone definitely makes it worth it. So final piece of housekeeping announcement, questions and answers. If you do, typically we tell people to use the Q&A feature, but feel free to use the chat as well. If we see a question that comes up during the presentation and we see it in the chat or in the Q&A, we'll try to bring it up and address it as the topic comes up. So that was my last item of housekeeping announcements. So today it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. So we have Lynn Drysdale. Lynn is a seasoned consumer protection attorney at JALA, Jacksonville Area Legal Aid. With over 3 decades of experience, she represents consumers in individual and class cases and engages in legislative advocacy relating to debt collection, payday loans, home improvement, and PACE transactions, military lending, automobile title loans, and mortgage litigation. Lynn has trained attorneys statewide in foreclosure defense and presented for organizations like the National Consumer Law Center and the National Association of Consumer Advocates. Our next speaker is Alice Vickers. Alice Vickers is a former director of the Florida Alliance for Consumer Protection, a statewide nonpartisan nonprofit that provided research, education, and advocacy on consumer protection and tenants' rights. Prior to joining Florida Alliance for Consumer Protection, she was a legal services attorney for 28 years, for 20 of those through Florida Legal Services. She advocated for clients on tenants' rights and consumer protection before the Florida Legislature. She has been a proud member of the Public Interest Law section of the Florida Bar for many years. She currently lives in Los Angeles with her husband and provides pro bono assistance to nonprofits around public policy and advocacy on non-bank predatory lending. So without further ado, I'm pleased to pass it over to Alicia, Alice, and Lynn. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jorge. We really do appreciate all that you're doing. I can't thank you enough for all of the educational opportunities you've been providing for us, and I learn something new every week, and so I do want to appreciate that. I know that Alice and I may be starting to sound like broken records, but she and I have been participating in the legislative process for, I guess, a little over 3 decades now, and it's changed quite a bit over that period of time. So what we're hoping to do today is just provide some information to help you get ready for the session. You may wonder why we're doing this in November, and we'll talk about that very soon. What we will do towards the end of the presentation today is I'm going to talk initially about what I think bad legislation is, or what a bad bill is, or what a bad law is. But what we'd really like to do is hear from you as to what you think are presently bad laws, a law that you would like to see changed, or a new law that you would like to try to get through the Florida legislature. So if you can think about those things as we go along and how you might progress to do something in that area legislatively as the session begins and as you start thinking about what's coming up, because As Alice and Laura and I and some others have been doing this for a really long time, we don't really have in Florida a consumer attorneys advocates organization that monitors and follows legislation. And I think we really need that group. And if there's one thing we can do from about today is getting that group together. So when I think of bad legislation, I think of bad bills such as the payday loan bill that would allow triple digit interest rates on certain types of loans. I would think about the PACE legislation that we just passed last year. I might think about legislation that maybe seems good in practice, but and I see a lot of good ideas coming in, thank you. But when you look at it as it happens in practice, it's really not a good bill. For instance, there were a lot of cities and counties that were passing laws, local ordinances, back in the late 90s, early 2000s, relating to predatory mortgage lending and also relating to title loans, because they folks advocates felt like they couldn't get what they wanted done in Tallahassee, because nobody was really paying attention to what was going on in Tallahassee. But if you started something legislatively locally, and you got the local press involved, and you got got friends and neighbors coming in to talk about things that were going on that meant something to them and their neighborhood, to their local politicians, it was interesting to see how when the state wouldn't do something, the cities and counties did, which eventually changed the state into doing something. But what was going on was that the state was passing laws that seemingly provided protections, but didn't really provide protections. But what they were doing was preempting all of these good laws that were being passed in the counties and the cities. And then sometimes you have a bill like the PACE bill last year, where we desperately need of protections for consumers, and there's a rogue actor that's making these types of transactions very harmful for consumers. So while we needed something to provide some consumer protection, what we got was not going to provide nearly any sufficient meaningful protections for consumers, but it might stop the problem of the rogue actor. And so we were sort of forced to determine whether this was bad legislation or good legislation, because it did provide some, albeit weak, consumer protections. It didn't provide any private right of action or remedies, but it did get rid of a bad actor. So, and I guess you're wondering, why would we focus on bad law? Well, in Florida, for the past at least couple of decades, I can't remember a good law that we have been able to pass. And so we've been acting in defense almost completely. Alice, would you like to add something to your thoughts on bad legislation?
Yeah, I saw this as more an overarching question. I really think bad legislation can boil down to anything you don't like, anything that might be hurting your clients. And for a lot of attorneys, anything that impedes your practice. And the reason I see this as a focus is because there simply are not resources in Florida to push affirmative legislation. So the limited resources available, that being you all, I think should focus on defending against the bad legislation. So that would be my suggestion. I also think you should look at your local level, your commissions, but additionally, this is applicable to the federal level. So I think all of these are fairly basic aspects of defending against bad legislation.
I think next we have a poll on how many of you know who your representatives are. Who would you contact if you were wanting to get involved legislatively.
And let me just say, I added this poll because in my years of talking to you all in the field, I was always kind of surprised at the number of people who did not know who their state senator or state representative was. So I'm hoping, since we just had an election, perhaps people will know, but definitely be honest here. Whether you have that name at your fingertips.
All right, so I'm gonna give it a few more seconds. We have we're almost at 20 people participating. Few more seconds, results are coming in. I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll and show the results. Okay, so you should all see the results on the screen.
Okay, those are honest. I like the honesty. That's good to see what people know.
And also what Alice has pointed out to me several times is keep in mind that you want to find out who the representatives and the senator is where you live, but also where your office is located. And sometimes that can be two separate places. And for a lot of legal services people, perhaps the representatives who are active where your clients are. A lot of that may be majority minority neighborhoods, but don't look just for your home address, but there's several other options. Jorge? So you can also go to, and you'll find an awful lot of information on Florida Online Sunshine. And if you go to the Florida or flsenate.gov, you can find out a lot of information about your senators and who your senators are, what committees they're on, what bills they have sponsored during the legislative session. And you can also go to My Florida House, which is the House equivalent to this website, where you could find out that same sort of information about the persons that are your representatives in the House of Representatives. I find that extremely helpful during the session, because you can not only can you get the information about your representatives and your senators and who they represent, but you can also get some information about their religious affiliations, what sort of hobbies they have, what sort of groups that they're involved in, what boards they serve on, and you can get a lot of information from someone from just looking at their bio in that area. Alice?
Yes, I would agree. And I just encourage people to go on there and explore. It's fairly user-friendly because it's meant for the public. And again, people often have over the years asked me questions like legislative history about bills. It's all there. You can go back probably 15, 20 years and look at legislative history online. My point being, just go on there and play around with it. It's a wealth of information for you to look at.
Once you find out who your senators and your representatives are, you want to start reaching out to them like now. Make sure that they know who you are, what sort of expertise you have. If you provide public information, either through as sort of a marketing thing for your law firm, or if you work for a legal services organization and you provide free legal services or clinics, to people who have certain types of problems, make sure your legislators know you as a resource and not vice versa. Because I think once they see you as a resource, and if you can come armed with knowledge, we used to always say during and before the session that we never could come with money to provide as lobbyists, but we could always come up knowledge, and because of the reputation that Alice, particularly Alice and others, developed with the legislators, and that's after having been there and walked the halls and knocked on doors and met with people and sat in vestibules waiting for senators to show up or their aides to show up. So it's a lot of one-on-one, whether that be in person one-on-one or on the phone one-on-one with the representatives and the senators and their aides. And that needs to start now. Again, not because you're first reaching out to them because you want something from them, but you want them to know that you have a particular expertise in areas such as maybe small loans, maybe mortgages, maybe reverse mortgages. Alice?
Again, I look at this a lot more basically than Lynn. What you need to do is after this webinar, you need to call or email your representative and your senator's office. And that information should be available not on the website just yet, but you should be able to Google your representative or senator and find where they are. And the reason that's important right now is that they are in a good mood. They just won the election. They will be in Tallahassee tomorrow, but they will be back in your district on Wednesday. And this is the time to make that outreach. You don't have to overthink it. You don't have to be concerned about what you know or don't know. You just want to get in there, either preferably in person, but you could do it by phone. You could do it by email. You want to make that connection now. And that doesn't include just your legislator. In many cases, the staff can be even more helpful. And as the session progresses, the staff is going to be the only people you can get in touch with. You have district staff and you have staff in Tallahassee. They're different people. You need to have the staff's number on your speed dial if you're going to engage legislatively. And further, they would be very interested in hearing from you. So, and I want to point out, because a lot of folks are with restricted programs, that doesn't mean you cannot engage with your own senator or representative. So I do encourage you to think about that.
Yes, and on that point, I've always heard if a congressman or senator or someone contacts you and asks you for information relating to legislation, that you can answer that question once, as long as you did not initiate the communication. Not certain if that's still the case, but just another thing to think about. So when we set up these appointments, that I think is when we find, and we can go to the next slide, I think. Yeah, one more.
So, and yeah, I would just encourage you to get all the contacts, because some of the contacts are not available on the website. So just make sure you do that.
Yes, and so when you go to these meetings, be prepared to talk about whatever they have an interest in. But if you're wanting to propose good legislation, then you would need to go with a draft of the legislation. And something that we've not talked about yet, but is really an important part of the process, is putting together short, sweet advocacy papers explaining why a certain bill would be really bad for Florida or would be really good for Florida. So these position papers are something that you can send out via email, you can send out with a letter, you can send out as an introduction when you want to set up a meeting. But it has to be short, it has to be to the point, and it has to say exactly why, in an elevator sort of way, speech kind of way, why the bill should not pass or why the bill should be passed. And so we've met with representatives in our area who we've known have had a certain interest in the smaller loan bills, who've had an interest in the mortgage types of legislation, who have had interest in landlord tenant. But it's also really important to get to know the staff of the committees, and these are some of the things that you can find at Florida Senate or FL Senate and My Florida House, because the staff of the committees can often be resources as well. So you'll want to get in touch with them. During the PACE bill, I think it was year before last, we actually were contacted by members of the minority party within the House to see if we would be getting involved in the PACE legislation at all, and seeing if they could help us in our efforts. So you never know. It could be the senator, him or herself. It could be an aide. It could be a member of the committee. But these are all good people to have information about. Alice?
Yeah, again, I think you're jumping ahead a little bit, Lynn. I just want you to think of this first meeting as meeting your legislator. I just think you need to get in there and make contact with your legislator. They haven't yet been assigned to committees. We don't yet know who the chairs will be of the committees, but ultimately you will want to know that. But this is just a meet and greet. You don't need to come in with a one-pager. You don't need to have anything on your mind other than, hello, I am your constituent, or my office is in your district. I am an expert on consumer protection or tenant rights. I want to be a resource for you. I want to be there to help your constituents. I want to meet you and work with you during the session. It's really just opening that dialogue in the next week. That's where you need to be.
Okay, next slide. So this basically lets you know why we're having this in November for a session that starts in March. As Alice mentioned earlier, there's an organizational session meeting tomorrow. And then there's going to be interim weeks for the Senate and the House, and then combined bodies. As we move over December, January, and February, and so by March 4th, I would think that most committee assignments would have been made, most bills would have been filed, and we're already elbow deep in lobbying well before March 4. So that's why we felt it important to get this information out there and get everybody focused on what they want to happen at the next legislative session now, even though it probably seems pretty early. Next slide. So there are basically two different ways of tracking bills that I'm aware of, and I am by no means an expert on this. But we have another poll, thank you, Jorge, is to see if anyone is familiar with one of these two legislative tracking opportunities, bill tracking opportunities.
So we're almost at 20 answers. So we are at 20 answers. Let's give it a few more seconds. And I'm gonna go ahead and close it and share the results. There you go.
Okay, well, it's good to know that so many people are using the Florida State Service, because it's free, and I wasn't sure if people would know where it is. Now, Lobby Tools is a paid service, and it's so it's going to be more expensive, obviously, but it does it is my understanding that you can compare bills back and forth when you've got, because during the session, a bill will be filed at the beginning of the session. And then here's the Lobby Tools landing page, and it is likely to change 5 or 6 times during the pendency of the session. And so you have to keep up with each of these changes. And oftentimes a change will occur right before a committee meeting. So you may have traveled over to testify about a certain bill, and then you get there and you find out the bill has been significantly changed. A lot of times what they'll do is a strike all. So you will really have a completely different bill with completely different protections or lack of protections or remedies or lack of remedies than you were looking at just the day before. So the Lobby Tools has tools where you can compare bills and see what's been changed in a bill and what's not. Now, the free one that's showing on the screen now, it will, if you can put in, if there's a state statute that you're interested in, you can put that in. So if anything is filed relating to that law, it will pop up. If there's a bill that has been filed and you want to watch the progress of the bill, then you can follow that. If you wanted to follow a certain committee and see what a certain committee is doing. So there are all different ways that you can set up the search so that you'll be alerted if something is happening on a bill or a topic even that you might be interested in. Now, some of the, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't have much to add other than you just need to go to that upper right hand tracker, and as Jorge just showed you, you need to it's very simple. You just create your own tracking service. Personally, I prefer this to Lobby Tools. I haven't used Lobby Tools in a number of years. I actually find the free service much more user-friendly. And so I highly recommend it. It's very easy to do. I will say, as we move forward on the panels, just following up with what Lynn just said, you do need to be really cautious about what you follow and what you don't, because you will get a lot of emails. So you should select, if you're going to track statutory sections, you need to really be careful about how many you input, because you can end up getting tons of emails. The same for committees that you follow. The committees of importance for the subject matters that we work on, that'll be on another slide, but you just need to be cautious about not being overzealous in what you're going to follow.
Okay, next slide.
I was gonna say, since we are here on this topic, we did have a question come in on the Q&A. Is the tracker only for active bills, or does it also include historical bills?
That's a great question. If you look in the center there where it says go to bill, it has bill number, and then it has the year, which has over.
Oh.
Go to bill. Okay, so look at that. There it is. If you scroll down, go all the way, Jorge, that's your legislative history. You can go and look at every year of session. It gets a little, sparse as you get down towards the bottom, but there it all is. There it is. And you can search it by, say it's 2001 and you want to know if there was legislation filed in 01 that had to do with Chapter 83, Part 2, security deposits. You can go and enter that chapter, not there, Jorge, go to back to go. No, just hit go. There you go.
Just hit go.
There
Okay.
it is. There are all the bills that were filed in 2001, and you can search up at the top the citation. So again, you could put in Chapter you could put in 83 point, I don't remember the security deposit, but say 83.49, which I think is the definitional section up there on the upper right where it says citation. Yeah, that's where you'd put the citation, and then you just search. So looky there, was a bill filed. So yeah, the legislative history part is great.
Right. So I'm gonna go back to the slides.
Right, and you can also use that in briefs and stuff too, when you think that legislative history might be important to a point that you're trying to make. So Alice already went over a lot of this. You can add statutory sections. If you know a bill's been filed, you can put the actual bill number for the House or the Senate in. Committees, and we've listed some of the committees that you'll start seeing a lot of the bills that we as consumer protection attorneys have an interest in. Senate banking and insurance. We've had some local people from our area that were uh, deeply involved in that committee. So when we have an opportunity, we always try to go over and meet with him in his office, and would either bring materials on a topic that we thought might be helpful to his constituents, or a topic that might be of interest to him. So you can find out this sort of information about what to track and who to track and who's doing what. And then use it in your second step, which is past your introduction, when you're actually trying to get to the advocacy part of your relationship with either the senator or the representative. Alice?
Yeah, I don't have anything else to add.
Okay, next slide. So this one is, I go back to the foreclosure bill several years ago, because a bill was filed. Everybody thought it was being sponsored by the banks because they were trying to speed up the foreclosure process, because they were saying that it was taking, because Florida was judicial, it was taking over 900 days to get foreclosure through. So they wanted to create this fast-paced foreclosure process. So, of course, when it comes out, we all think it's a horrible bill, and we just have to do everything. We have to do everything we can to defeat it. But as the bill went along, we started to see how there were unintended consequences that might make this bill a little more palatable than we thought, relating to what was going to be required. Because before you could file a foreclosure lawsuit, because what we later learned is it wasn't the banks that was pushing the speeded up foreclosure process. It was the COAs and HOAs, because they were pissed off at the banks because they had all the mill firms filing all these foreclosure lawsuits and then just sitting on them. And so the HOAs and COAs felt like it was impeding their foreclosure progress. So, you had judges come and say, look, if the plaintiff on the other side would just do their job, I can get you a foreclosure judgment in 2 months. It's not the consumers or the borrowers that are the problem. It's the banks. But at any rate, so we worked to try to defeat the bill, but as it turned out, it ended up being a bill that we could use. I'm not going to say it was a good bill, but it was something that we could use in the context of foreclosure lawsuits that was actually turned out to be a tool. But the first question is, are you sure it's a bad bill? And I don't think any of us can tell by ourselves. So that's why it's important to reach out to others. And we've listed a bunch of the groups that you might ordinarily think about: NACA, the umbrella groups. Certainly the public interest law section of the Florida Bar is going to become more and more active this year with trainings and everything else. So we're really excited about people becoming involved in that, and legislatively, Center for Responsible Lending and National Consumer Law Center. What I think needs to happen in Florida, since we have so many bright people working here, And we're putting up another poll while I finish this to see if any of these groups are groups that you have worked with. And then if you have other groups that you would like to recommend, we certainly would like to hear about those, and we can talk about those towards the end. But the best way to find out if a bill is bad, talk to people who do what you do and have the same interests that you have to see what they think. A consumer protection lawyer lobby, either formal or informal, I think would go a long way in this process of giving us a sounding board so we can figure out whether legislation's good or bad. Because like I said, sometimes you can't even tell till the end. Pace, we wanted to fight it, but then there were some good parts, bad parts. And when it came down to the end, we were trying to determine whether we should write to veto or support the bill when we were writing the governor, and it was a real struggle to figure out which was the best thing to do. So remember, reaching out to others is a key component to trying to determine if a bill's bad or good, and if you want to try to stop it. And the best way to try to stop it is just to try to throw up roadblocks.
And I am sharing the results from the polls. Obviously, most people are familiar with pills. One that surprised me is Center for Responsible Lending. I personally had no idea about that group, so see, we all learned something new today. But yeah, sharing the results here with the folks that answered.
And if anybody is interested in, getting up, even if it's just a very informal group, so we can have these conversations as the session approaches, and as we go through the session, but I think more so as the session approaches, so we can tell what's being filed and how we need to respond. Alice?
Thanks. As I told Lynn, this slide is probably the most important one to me that I made. Having lobbied for 30 years, it was really frustrating to learn, perhaps in a committee meeting or in some other venue, someone come forward to oppose a bill who had not gone through any vetting with anybody else. Personally, in all my years working down there, I would never, ever come out against a bill before I had talked to a lot of other people. You can read a bill, and I will say, I see a lot of folks are familiar with the Housing Umbrella Group. Housing bills are very specific, or housing law is very specific to your county court. And I cannot tell you how many times there would be disagreement. I'm not telling you all anything you don't know among the different counties and or districts about certain provisions within Chapter 83. So it's just very important to vet out with others what you are thinking about a bill. The Center for Responsible Lending even has a staff person assigned to the state of Florida. Her name is Yasmin. They work on non-bank lending issues, all non-bank lending issues. They're an excellent resource. They will do economic studies for you. They are an endless source of information. So if you're going to work in that area, you really need to make that connection with those folks. And so, as Lynn pointed out, that's why I said you've got to come up with your position on the bill. You can't go meet a legislator and be unclear. They're going to ask you two questions. Do you oppose the bill? Or more especially, can you fix the bill? They really prefer it if you can fix the bill. So in addition to coming up with your position on the bill by talking to a lot of people, if you think the bill can be fixed and you have amendatory language, you need to run that by a lot of people also. You need to have something specific that others can look in and edit and weigh in on. So Those are my thoughts.
Okay, next slide. Okay, so once you find a bill, either through your tracking service or just because a legislator calls you and has questions because you have a client who's having a problem and you're doing some research and you figure out if there was a change to a law that your client might be protected, or if you have a special interest like PACE or small lending or the earned wage access bill. Once you find one of those, you want to add the bill to your tracking service if it's not already there. Then you want to look at the committees that the bill has been assigned to and track each individual committee. And there'll be a group of committees in the House and a group of committees in the Senate. I don't know this to be true, but I've heard that if the bill is really bad and folks don't want the bill to pass, then it'll get assigned to a lot of different committees. I don't
That
know
is
that.
true. That's most definitely true. The sweet spot for them is 3 committees. 2 committees indicates that the power structure at the legislature wants to ram that bill through. 4 committees indicates that the power structure would like to see that bill die. So that's your first key, what you're, up against in terms of bad legislation. Check out those number of committees.
So, and then you're going to want to make sure that you know when they meet and what's going to be on the agenda when they meet, because you're going to want to contact each and every member on the committee with some sort of email message, maybe sending them your position paper, letting them know why the bill is really bad or why the bill's really good. Probably in all communications with them, you want to start out with the heading by saying whether or not you oppose or support a bill in any communications with them, so that you can just get that out of the way right out front. And then if you've had meetings with them already, you probably don't need to meet with them in person again, but you can always make that offer. You're going to have to decide how aggressively you're going to get involved in the committee meetings, and we'll talk about that with the next couple of slides. But at the very least, you want to have your position spelled out and in a concise way, and you want to be able to communicate that to the members of the committee, the members of the committee staff, and then, of course, you're going to be speaking probably primarily with aides as you're reaching out to legislators about certain bills. Alice?
I would say the best chance you have of talking to your legislators if when you get off of this webinar, you go and try to find your legislator, reach out and try to meet with them. Once they know you, they are more inclined to meet with you further down the road, particularly if you are a constituent. That is why it is so important to engage in the process. A constituent is always going to have better luck meeting with the legislator than a nonprofit lobbyist. So get those relationships started now, so that you can use those when things get frantic during the session.
And we've talked about utilizing clients and client stories in the legislative process. And we've talked about putting together a position paper so it's very clear and concise as to what your position on the legislation that you're reaching out to them about is, whether you support it or are opposing it. But it's also along the lines of what Alice was saying, if you're a constituent, they're going to be more interested in listening to you. But if you've also got clients who are constituents, who you can perhaps get on a Zoom call with a legislator or take to their office and have them meet. I think that's really important, that they see how it's affecting real human beings that live in their district. It's going to have an important impact on them, I think, more so than anyone sending out an email message or a letter. Also, the aggregation of a lot of client stories. Let's say, for instance, if I have a lot of PACE loan horror stories, if I could put those stories together, then I have something to show the legislature as to the magnitude of the problem and the reach. So those are some important pieces of information you can provide to a legislature once you find a bill, once you're tracking it, and once you're reaching out to the different players in the process. Alice?
Again, I keep it a lot more simple than Lynn. You don't need to have a position paper. You don't need to have a white paper. A one pager is nice. So if you're going to meet with somebody, something you can pass off to them, but don't burden yourself. You'll become overwhelmed, and this will become too much if you have a litigation practice also. The goal is to engage, and if you overthink it and overburden yourself, you're not going to engage. So keep it as simple as you can for you as a constituent of your legislator.
Okay, next slide. So the next two are, should I visit Tallahassee and should I testify? So I think Alice and I have divergent views on this. And it's last session, it was always a struggle to figure out whether to make the trip over, because, it's a good 3 hours over, sitting around for a couple of hours, going and visiting legislators, testifying maybe for a minute or two, and then driving back. And so it's a huge time commitment. And quite frankly, over the past several years, I found that that it used to be that legislators would at least try to pretend like they were paying attention when you got up to speak. They would wander in and out of the room, but that was just sort of anticipated and nobody thought that much of it. But now it's becoming more and more clear that the legislatures that we have been talking to have gotten their talking points from the industry or someone on the other side, and no matter what you get up there and say, that they're going to have their opinions, and so what you're going to say is not going to make any difference. Do I think that means that it's not worth the time and effort to go over there and put a face to a problem, particularly if you can bring a client with you? No, I don't. I think that we need to be engaged in Tallahassee. And quite frankly, I'm afraid that we have the laws in Florida now that we deserve, because we aren't going over. We aren't organized. We haven't been organized in a while. People aren't going to Tallahassee to testify as to the issues that are important to them. And I completely understand how it's inconvenient. It takes up a lot of time. It takes up time away from your cases and your clients, and it's not an easy thing to do. But I think we either have to decide if we're going to get involved this year or we're not, if we want to make any difference at all. I think if you're going to visit Tallahassee to testify, I don't know that it's what you say is going to make a lot of difference. But I do think that while you're there, going from office to office of some legislators that you have reached out to in advance, so it's not just random speaking, random swinging by, although you can do some of that too. I think the best part of going to Tallahassee is meeting face to face with people. Now, I've done that and met face to face with people and set up Zoom calls and all of that sort of thing. But keep in mind that a lot of this legislation that we're dealing with now is not written by the legislator. It's written by the lobbyist. And, that's not to say that the other side lobbyists are any worse at this than we are. We draft legislation for legislators as well that we think would be helpful to consumers, and that we, because of our litigation experience, know what needs to be in and out of a protection, what remedies need to be available, and that sort of thing. And so I think if we want to have these meetings, keep in mind that we may not always be talking with the legislature. I've set up meetings, Zoom meetings with legislators before, and had them get on the call, say hello, and then immediately get off the call, leaving me to argue why the bill was bad with the lobbyist on the other side as opposed to the legislature. So in some respects, it seems like the lobbyists run the show. And if we have no lobbyist, and if we're not there and we're not present, we're not testifying, we're not reaching out and creating these relationships, then we're just going to end up with the laws that we have, and we're not going to be protecting consumers. But it's a decision we need to make. I'm not saying it should be on us, but somebody's got to do it. Alice?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I agree with Lynn. If it'd be wonderful if you can come to Tallahassee. I will say, in the 30 plus years that I was down there, I could count on one hand how many times someone came, other than Lynn. Lynn has been there many times. It is easier for her to get there than if you're in Miami. So we understand that. Legal services used to have lobby days, and a lot of folks would come up. Many organizations have lobby days. It's a wonderful time. Somebody else sets up all the appointments, and you wander around and meet with people and talk about the issues. But again, that has not happened in an extremely long time. So now that I have left Florida, there is no one down there regularly walking the halls on these issues. So to the extent you maybe would like a little vacation in Tallahassee in March, it's beautiful at that time of year. You could coordinate it with making appointments. You need to make the appointments well in advance. It becomes very difficult to get appointments as the session progresses. If you do go to Tallahassee and you do make appointments, do not get pissed off if you don't meet the legislator, but you meet the aide. That happens a lot. Again, depending on the aide and the legislator, sometimes the aide can be even better than meeting with the legislator. If you are going to come to Tallahassee and testify, you really need to talk to somebody who has testified before. We'll talk to Lynn. You know, that could be a whole webinar talking about how you might testify. Again, as a non-lobbyist coming up there, expressing your opinions, they're going to be much kinder to you than they are to someone they see a lot. So it's not as scary as it might seem.
Okay, next slide. So just a couple of things to review from last year. So I think we've talked about how to arrive at your position, and I think the theme this year is organizing and bouncing the legislation off people at the national level, at the local level, litigators who are working in this area. A white paper is, I think, helpful, can be helpful through the process for no other reason than just so you can put your thoughts on paper and organize them. I think sometimes the value of putting together something like that is being able to help me put together in my mind. Soliciting other groups to get involved. Alice has built up an incredible coalition over the Small Lending Act types of legislation bills, and this group has every type of consumer protection or just human rights organization I can think of that would be interested in this type of legislation. And it's a It's a strong group. It's a consistent group. They meet regularly and they act. So it would be great if we could do something like that in legal services. So if you want to amend a bill, you need to have your proposed draft amendments in your back pocket. And, in the good old days, we would, like Alice was saying, we would organize and hold press conferences, have lobby days, and that sort of thing. One thing that I think is invaluable, and it can be a double-edged sword, but I think more so than in litigation and legislation, if you can find a reporter that is interested in the topic, they can a lot of times do a lot more legislative advocacy than we can, just with the power of their pen. Although I must say lately, particularly with the PACE thing, I've seen a lot of things published, leaking what I thought was some pretty damning information, and folks basically just sort of thought, well, so what else is new? So I don't want to think this, but I'm afraid that the reason for that is that people just have gotten used to bad actors in politics. But I think we're going to have a great session. I think if we could get some organization working, that we will have a nice group and we can just keep this discussion going through the end of session. Alice, did you have anything to add? And if not, then we'll talk about bills people might want to.
I just wanted to add that because again, this is something that over the years I saw a lot. You cannot just say, well, I'd like to amend this bill. You cannot go to a legislator and say, yeah, we could probably amend it. You need to have written amendatory language. You need to, I am happy to provide you any feedback or help on how to draft an amendment to a bill. But even if you don't know how to do that, if you just, put pen to paper and have something actually in writing, don't go to anyone and just say, yeah, we could amend the bill. It would kind of be like this. That is not at all helpful. As for reporters, you really need to kind of like talking to your local legislators. You should know who your local media personalities are that may have an interest in tenants' rights or consumer protections. Most of the areas in the state do have reporters who are interested in these issues, and they would love to talk to you about these issues. They're always looking for good stories. So that is an excellent way to get your issue out there.
Okay. Jorge, is there a way that we can open up I think there's not a whole ton of people that we could open up for people to suggest bills or issues that would like to watch out for this year, or folks who might be interested in joining a group. I have Chandra's name, Duchette. I really appreciate that, Chandra. But if others are interested, I certainly will write down those names.
Yes, I see Randall raise his hand. I'm gonna try to bring him off mute if he wants to speak out. Let's see.
Perfect. Thank you.
Randall, another Pills member.
Yes.
Trying to give you access, Randall. Bear with me.
And thank you for all the materials you put in the chat, Jorge, the lobby day example and all of that. I would really like to see us do that again.
Which, by the way, I Googled, as you were mentioning it, I Googled Florida Legal Services lobby days, and I found a lot of different lobby days. So if anybody's interested in looking how these are organized, it's just a great example. I chose that specific organization, but you will see how both sides, so to speak, organize these lobby days. So Randall, I
Yeah, I
believe
finally
you're able
found.
to speak.
Yeah, I finally figured out how to unmute myself. I'm sorry, but yes, but I was doing a lot of other things when I heard my name called. So what is it that you wanted me to speak about? Because I put several things on the chat.
Oh my! I saw your hand raised, so I thought you just wanted to speak out. So that's why I brought you
Oh,
off mute.
okay. Well, I'm experimenting on how to use this, but I did put something in the chat there where you're talking about when you were talking about other organizations that people belong to. I put other, and I just wanted to make you all aware about, well, and I know Lynn and Alice are familiar with it because they were members of my ACE Charitable Legal Services Inc. But I'm also wanting them to know that I'm doing a lot of work now with the Florida Supreme Court Historical Society. My background, basically, and interest in all this is that I for 7 years, I worked for Chief Justice Boyd in the Florida Supreme Court, and so much of this stuff is so similar. And I was actually a registered lobbyist for the Florida Supreme Court, so I'm familiar with these procedures. I haven't been active since then, but that's my take on this. I think I'm very much interested in being part, if not actually forming a statewide organization. That's what this state needs. So
That's wonderful, Randy. We really do appreciate that, and we'll certainly get together after this and then maybe get others involved.
well, I am with Pills now, and they did appoint me the chairman of the pro bono or committee. So
Excellent, excellent.
so I am now kind of thrust into all this because the
Mhm.
last chairman left middle of last year, and so I'm learning everything I can about how it's operating. But I think that's the starting point.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts on legislation that we might like to, or that we are afraid we may see this session, or that we might want to get involved with?
I'm not aware of any right now. That's one of the things I'm going to be doing is go through and see what bills are being filed and see which ones I think of might be of very interest.
Yeah.
So
Well, thank you.
I know we're at time. I did drop the CLE code. I did have one topic that I was discussing with Lena and Alice prior to. Oh, I do get a message saying that the CLE code is not working. I'll double check to see what's happening there, but don't worry, I'll still email the correct code. I'll make sure that it's working correctly. Maybe I copied it incorrectly. But the topic that Lena and Alice and I were discussing, it's actually a recent issue. We've seen this a lot with the mobile home parks. And it's just as an example of one of those stories to be on be on the lookout for. A year ago, there was a bill that was aiming to increase the amount of relocation assistance for mobile homes whenever there was a park closure. And recently, there was a major park closure announced, I believe, down in Miami-Dade. It's called Little Abner. It's more than 900 homes. So that kind of goes to those type of stories. So, Lynn and Alice, if there were any legislation related to mobile home parks, is this how would I start by tracking it? What type of stories do legislatures want to hear? It's whether it's one client story or what's out there in the news. Any thoughts or suggestions on how to approach that?
Well, I would start tracking your portions of 723 that have to do with those mobile home reimbursements so you can see the bill pop up. I think that you would find excellent alignment with everything from the NAACP to the Florida Catholic Conference of Bishops and the Community Justice Project down in Miami. I think all of those would be excellent folks to join you in any support of an increase in those monies. I would also look back at the legislative history, and I could try to get a year for you. A good argument to make, and this is helpful in just about anything you do, is I do remember when that law was initially created, and what you've got now is an excellent argument that amount has not been increased. And I'm going to guess here at least 15 to maybe 20 years since there's been an increase in that fund for mobile home park dwellers. So I think you've got a lot of tools that you can start using on that issue. I think it's a really good one.
And as Troy mentioned in the chat, I discovered the error in the CLE code. I just had an extra two. So I'll make sure to send out the correct one. I dropped it here in the chat again. So I know we're a little bit over time. Lynn and Alicia and Alice, thank you so much for this amazing webinar. I'm just making sure we don't have any final unanswered questions. And thank you everybody that registered. Let's see. We hope this session provided attendees with everything that you needed, and hopefully after this webinar, you have some homework to do. As it was mentioned during the webinar, you know, track down your legislator. I'm gonna do that myself. And I guess that would be it. I have the CLE code. I'm correcting it again here just in case in my notes. Make sure to claim your credits and feel free to reach out if you have any other questions. Thank you again for your time and have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks, bye.